The word Tanakh should be familiar to you from last semester. It is an acronym that describes the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is divided into three parts, the Jewish Bible, the T and the N and the K. T is for Torah, N is for Nevi'im, and K is for Ketubim. The V can be a B or a V sound. The Torah we covered already, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which I didn't really cover this year, but maybe I'll have a chance to. The Ketuvim we covered briefly. The word Ketuvim means the writings, and it's kind of a hodgepodge. It's got a history book, 1 and 2 Chronicles. It's got poetry books. It has wisdom literature. And then it has all these great stories, Tobit, Judith, Esther. And we did Ruth and Jonah and Daniel, and we will do Job. And it used to be when we taught a full year of Scripture that I combined these books into one unit. And the second unit of that semester, second unit of sophomore year, was the Nevi'im. And the word Nevi'im means the prophets. So the Torah is the law, the Nevi'im is the prophets. Again, the Torah can also be referred to as the Pentateuch. And the Nevi'im contains what we sometimes refer to as historical books, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And in the Hebrew Bible, those are called the former prophets. It's the stories of people like Deborah and Samuel and Huldah and Elijah and Elisha and the prophets and the kings. And the second unit of second semester of sophomore year covered the latter prophets, what are known as the writing prophets. There's no collection of the writings of Elijah or the writings of Samuel or the writings of Huldah, but there are collections of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel's teachings. Those are the major prophets. And there are writings of what Amos and Hosea and the other minor prophets said as well. Our textbook had mentioned that Daniel is considered one of the major prophets, and really the book of Daniel is some narrative stories, Daniel and his friends in the lion's den and in the fiery furnace, and then some apocalyptic stuff. So for our purposes, I'm not putting Daniel in here. And the book of Jonah, too, is not a collection of the teachings of a prophet named Jonah. It's a story about a prophet named Jonah. But if we include Jonah here, we get this nice number 12, which is very biblical, obviously. But Jonah really does not belong there as well. And this presentation is about the major and minor prophets, and I'm condensing weeks of lessons into one short PowerPoint here. So I'm going to focus on the major and minor prophets. As we study the prophets, there's some important things to know about them. First of all, where did they live or when did they live? Is this a prophet from the north or the south? Is this a pre-exilic prophet? Is this somebody writing from exile in Babylon? What's the prophet's main message, or what messages does the prophet have to communicate even to us today? What techniques did the prophet use? Sometimes they had visions or dreams that had to be interpreted symbolically. Sometimes prophets did wild things like breaking jars or wearing horns on their head, or Isaiah walked around Jerusalem naked, or Ezekiel cut off all of his hair and his beard with a sword and did weird stuff with it. So what did the prophets do to give their message to the people? What type of prophet was he? And here I should have a little pronoun issue. There are women prophets described in the Bible. Miriam is described as a prophetess. Deborah the judge is described as a prophet. And Huldah is the prophet that King Josiah consults when the book of the law is found. And are there any connections to other prophets? Can we compare and contrast them to other prophets? Did they live at the same time as other prophets? So again, I'm racing through a lot of material here. There were prophets who worked for the kings. Isaiah was probably a royal prophet. And we did the story of King Ahab and King Jehoshaphat going to battle. And Jehoshaphat asks Ahab to consult God. And the king of Israel calls his prophets, about 400 of them, and asks the prophets if he should go fight. And all the prophets say, yeah, go attack. You're going to be fine. And Jehoshaphat says, is there anybody else we can ask? And Ahab says, well, there's one other prophet, but I don't like to ask him things because he doesn't say good things for me. So there's a problem with being a prophet who's connected to a king, but not in the case of Isaiah, who was prophet to King Hezekiah. There were prophets who were priests as well. For instance, Samuel was a priest. He was a Levite and also a prophet and a judge. Jeremiah and Ezekiel both describe themselves as being from priestly families. The prophet Malachi was probably a priest because he was a whistleblower describing some unsavory practices in the Holocaust. Haggai might have been a priest as well. There were priests or professional prophets, prophets that you could hire. And back when we studied King Saul, when Saul became king, he kind of happened on the prophet Samuel by chance. They were looking for some donkeys that they had lost, and Saul said, let's go ask the prophet where the donkeys are. And the guy says, well, all I have is a quarter of a shekel of silver. If I give that to the man of God, he'll advise us. And apparently you could hire a prophet, and the prophet would tell you where your donkeys were or if your corn would grow. In the same way, Elisha the prophet, who's the heir of Elijah, calls one of the guild prophets, probably some young guy who can run fast, and says, take a flask of oil with you, go to Ramoth Gilead, and anoint Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, as king of Israel. And once you anoint him, run, because Jehu is going to start killing people. He kills off Ahab's family. He has Jezebel chucked out a window. So you could hire a prophet to go and do jobs for you. And finally, there are prophets that were amateurs. Micah may have been an amateur, and Amos himself claims that he's not a professional prophet. He brags about being a shepherd and a dresser of sycamores who got called by God to come and preach to the people. I talked at one point in the class about the concepts of justice and righteousness, and even though these words might seem similar, in Hebrew they have two distinct origins, mishpat and tzedek. And tzedek, or righteousness, is about having a right relationship with God. You don't worship other gods. You don't offend God's name. You set aside time to worship God. The first commandments. And then mishpat, or justice, is about having right relationship with other people. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not lie. Don't desire things that belong to other people. And some of the prophets emphasize relationship with God. Some of the prophets emphasize relationship with others. And the best prophets find a way to tie these two concepts together. Going to skip this, but we talked about the idea of monolatry. This was a stone tablet where the Moabites were boasting about how Chemosh was on their side, and Chemosh told them to go and destroy the Israelites. And so I devoted them to destruction for Ashtar Chemosh. And this whole idea of monolatry, that Chemosh is our God, and Chemosh loves us, and Chemosh hates you, and our God's going to fight on behalf of you. And it's interesting that the transition from polytheism to monolatry to monotheism, scholars go back and forth about when this took place. And one of the earliest possibilities of real monotheism could be in Amos chapter 1, where he's talking about God destroying all of their neighbors, which could seem a very nationalistic sort of outlook, a very monolatrist worldview. Yahweh's our God, and Yahweh's going to punish you. But then at the end of Amos are these interesting passages where Amos says, oh, Israel, you're like the Ethiopians to me. I brought Israel out of the land of Egypt just as I brought the Philistines from the land of Caphtor, and just as I brought the Arameans from Ker, which makes some scholars think that monotheism might begin as early as Amos, which would be 800 years before Jesus. It's not the most clear shift to monotheism doesn't come until the exile, and that's with 2nd Isaiah. So again, are we moving towards monotheism? Are we moving towards to universalism? Quick, putting the prophets in their historical perspective, Amos and Hosea both preached in the north before it was destroyed. Amos is very social justice oriented, concerned with right relationship with others. Hosea is a prophet more about righteousness. Micah and Isaiah, first Isaiah, the real guy, were preaching about the same time, maybe a little bit later, but they were preaching in Judah. So they have similar time periods, but geographically are different. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the second part of Isaiah are right in the exile. Haggai and Zechariah, which some did as extra credit, comes during the Persian period as the Israelites are getting ready to rebuild the temple. And then Malachi and 3rd Isaiah are clearly post-exilic. The story of Jonah takes place before Assyria is destroyed, but probably not an actual story. Nahum is bragging about how God has smashed the Assyrians. Habakkuk, Joel, Obadiah, Zephaniah. We're not sure exactly when all of these prophets lived, but obviously spaced out over hundreds of years of Israel's history. Quick little look at the major prophets, and let me be clear, they're called the major prophets because they have big books. It's not because they're necessarily more important. I'll talk about Hosea in just a few minutes here. But the book of Isaiah, biggest book in the Bible, probably written, part of it during the Assyrian period, part of it written in the Babylonian exile, and then part of it clearly written after the exile. Jeremiah was preaching in Jerusalem in the years up till the destruction of Jerusalem. And Ezekiel, I didn't tell you this, but the Jews were actually sent into exile in 598, and the rest of them sent into exile in 587. And Ezekiel was actually in exile when he got his call, and he preached at the same time as Jeremiah, but hundreds of miles away, and preached into the exile as well. By the way, the call of the prophets, Isaiah's in the temple. He hears a voice from God, sees an angel in the sky. He's very excited about it. Ezekiel also has a dramatic vision of God. He's in exile, which is surprising. He also has a very eager response to it. And Jeremiah's response to God's call is a little reluctant. I'm not sure if I'm ready for this. Maybe I'm too young. So prophets might have had, and it doesn't describe any dramatic experience. So different prophets had different experiences of being called by God and even different ways of responding to that call. Instead, I'm going to jump to music. There are a lot of different styles of music, and here I've got some reggae, I've got some Negro spirituals, I've got some folk music. A lot of music finds its roots in the prophetic literature or in biblical themes. Dry Bones, and I would recommend the version by Blind Boys of Alabama, is taking one of the visions of Ezekiel. Woody Guthrie, a folk singer, who also wrote a song about the Columbia, wrote Ezekiel Saw the Wheel. The great Louis Armstrong, Satchel Mouth, sings a great version of Let My People Go. The Melodians and Bob Marley and Culture are all reggae musicians. Gentleman is a reggae / hip-hop style. All use biblical themes from the book of Daniel, the small axe, or Ezekiel's dry bones, or Daniel in the lion's den. I'm going to ask you to listen to one of these songs, or Jesus Christ. I like U2's version of it. Listen to one of these songs and write a little reflection on it.